Hello, everyone. Welcome, and this is Dr. Terrence Duncan, and we're going to talk about the purpose statement. And this lecture video is designed to help students working on an outline and perspectives, as well as their dissertation as it relates to the purpose statement. You may recall during a problem statement that it's a complex problem required by quantifiable severity. The general problem is a 30,000-foot view, and it encompasses the broader population, whereas the specific problem provides an eagle-eye view, and your specific population has been identified. You will also recall that your support should be by peer-reviewed journals less than 5 years old. As you work on the problem statement, you may recall in the last lecture that the problem statement becomes the anchor for the remainder of your dissertation. And so one thing that students usually and candidates tend to struggle with is alignment. And so the problem statement alignment is where it logically flows from the problem statement. And as you continue to work on various sections of the first chapter, you will see that you are responsible for creating connectivity and alignment. Even when you are doing a presentation of the findings, you're still going to loop back to the problem statement. So that brief paragraph, that 250 word paragraph, is very consequential to the remainder of your dissertation. And so as you continue to work on chapter 1, you're going to have a continued decomposition. So we're going to go from the problem statement, from the specific problem, the what, and now we're going to look at the why in this particular lecture. It also provides consistency amongst all other components of the study, even your literature review, which has certain page requirements, sometimes 30 to 40 or even more, depending on the university. It still has to connect to the problem statement. So the purpose statement is a continued breakdown of the problem statement to identify your research method. It forms the primary reason to conduct your study. It also addresses the phenomenon, interest, or examine relationship between variables. It also precedes the hypothesis or your research questions and specifies the target research population in a way that it aligns with the problem statement. As you are trying to identify the appropriate type of research method for your study, you want to seek the why of the complex problem. For qualitative studies, you want to explore themes, seek understanding, as well as consider open-ended questions. Under the quantitative method, you want to examine the relationship between variables. It is more data-driven, and the questions tend to be closed-ended. Prior to selecting your research method, you have to note that your research connectivity drives your selected method, and you have to refrain from personal selection to avoid bias. You want to also cross-examine studies from a qualitative and quantitative approach and identify potential gaps in the literature. So does the gap in the literature say that that it's heavy on the qualitative side and quantitative research needs to be conducted in this particular area, or vice versa? Or what is the deficits of providing a quantitative research that may necessitate a qualitative approach? And so what I tend to see from students moving from a graduate level into the doctoral program, or even working on their perspectives, is that they are specifically locked into a particular method just because of their preference. And it's not about your preference, it's about your research. So what does the research say is necessary, or what other research have you seen to support the reason for you to do this particular desired research method? And also, did you look at similar number of articles or dissertations to see the difference between the two and to make a fair evaluation prior to selecting your method? Refrain from selecting your personal approach and refrain from being top heavy on your desired research approach just to justify a particular scope of study. Reason being is that there is a lot of bias from students and even candidates early in the program, and you want to have a holistic approach. What I have seen in the 6+ years from an instructor standpoint, from a dissertation chair standpoint, and from a dissertation consultant standpoint, is that students tend to select qualitative methods just because that's what they're comfortable with. I know that for the most part, most graduate studies doesn't focus on data or quantitative studies or quantitative analysis. And so it does tend to show that particular progression when it comes to the doctoral program, at least from the students and candidates that I work with. And then what happens sometimes is that because of their bias, it provides misalignment. So you're talking about, and I usually see this with the problem statement, they want to talk about the relationship between variables, but then they want to provide a qualitative study, and that doesn't align correctly. So if you want to look at the relationships, you want to do more of a quantitative study and then pick the research design associated with the quantitative method to be able to address your variable relationships. Gap identification. Again, you are contributing to the literature. As a student and a candidate, you're basically the apprentice prior to being certified to be an electrician or be a certified plumber or something of that nature. So you are learning about the process. And so because of that, you want to be able to focus on gap identification so that can help develop your dissertation. Your target population, does it match with your research method? So if you're trying to do a qualitative study in healthcare and you don't have access to those particular individuals, how are you going to conduct that study, right? So if you're doing a quantitative study, you can actually send surveys across a wider gap using different tools available, or you can attend conferences or whatever the case may be to collect your data. And so it also expediency of time. Students and candidates have a preference of when they would like to graduate a program. And even though universities mostly say that it's going to take X amount of years to graduate, one thing to keep in mind is just based on the student performance or the candidate performance. And so if you are providing misalignment and you are basically hell-bent determined to not consider a different method and continue to provide misalignment, then it creates a situation where you're going to be in a program a little bit longer than others. And so even though that we want to provide the tools and resources for you to graduate on time and in a manner that you would like to, you have to understand that you're basically taking something that's existing out of thin air and you're creating 100, 150 pages or even more on something that you have an interest in that's relative to the industry or the organization itself. And then having a dual lens approach. At some point of your dissertation writing, you will have to make a comparative analysis between qualitative and quantitative methods as it relates to your outline, your perspectives, as well as your dissertation. And you will also have activities, discussions, and essays associated with this approach as well. So you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And even though quantitative may not be in your skill set, you want to try to get yourself familiar with that. If you have a gap of knowledge in a particular area, then you are responsible for ensuring that you meet that gap and address it immediately. Some of the key characteristics of the purpose statements. This also tends to be around 250 to 300 words, and you'll see that throughout a lot of the first set of categories in the first chapter of your dissertation, that you're going to have brief paragraphs. You're going to have a brief, concise look into certain headings of your particular dissertation outline or your perspectives. And you will always start your first sentence identifying and signaling to the audience what your study will try to do. And so you will start off by saying the purpose of this method/design study is to explore or examine. And then that's when you fill in the gaps based on your specific problem. Again, 250 to 300 words, but you will always lead off with the sentence. The reason being is it's not just for your benefit, it's not just for my benefit, but it's also for your committee reader, your methodologist, as well as the general audience as well. You want to make sure that you're very clear and concise for the duration of your dissertation and ensure that you're maintaining alignment. You want to identify and restate the target audience. So similar to the specific problem, you will continue to restate the target audience throughout numerous parts of your dissertation and at various parts of your outline and your perspectives. And then you want to conclude a paragraph identifying the identified gaps with supporting research. And even though that 3 is recommended, you want to have a minimum of 1 peer-reviewed journal reference less than 5 years old. And if you see my lectures, that is something I'm going to say. Sometimes I'm going to write it out. But if you see 1 peer-reviewed journal reference, keep in mind that it should be less than 5 years old. So we're going to break down that first sentence a little bit more. So the purpose of this qualitative or quantitative method or design study is to explore or examine. And so for your consideration, when you select a method, it's either qualitative or quantitative. And so if you're not sure, look at Cresswell, look at some other research in the school resources to help you determine the distinction between the two. And now, as far as the research design, this is an exercise of practice, not precision. If you're on the prospectus and the outline, I've actually had doctoral candidates as a chair actually had to change their studies because there was some mild misalignment. And so I've seen people start off with qualitative and then doing either quantitative or they had to redo the entire study. In other words, they had to shift over to quantitative. And it's just because of the alignment, and your methodologist is responsible for ensuring that there is alignment throughout the continuity of your particular study. And so if you're not sure, some of the more standard studies that I see for quantitative is regression analysis, ex post facto studies. Qualitative, I see case studies. That seems to be more popular because you're just looking at one particular population and then you're interviewing a certain number of participants. Another consideration to keep in mind is the explore, the examine. So if you look at this particular area on explore, examine, the explore, it is associated with qualitative. And so they'll say the purpose of this qualitative case study is to explore XYZ. Under the consideration, if you go quantitative, you want to use the word examine. The purpose of this quantitative ex post facto study is to examine. So remember, this has to be your first sentence. The purpose of this XY study is to Z. And, you want to look at different examples. Again, Creswell is a good resource. It's a popular resource, regardless of the university affiliation, to rely on, as it is a methodologist book, to be able to help shape the narrative for your particular study. Selecting your target population. The minimum number of participants required to complete your study is necessary, and do not guess. What I tend to see, especially in the outline, is that there's no research support and people are throwing random wild numbers that would take either forever and a day or may not even meet the standard requirements to make it a qualifiable study. So you need to know what the minimum number is for that particular type of study based on your research to have to make this a valid study. So for a case study, what I typically see is 20 is the number. So I'm just using this as an example. If you're going to do a quantitative case study, you're going to state that 20 participants will, from your particular population class and region, will be used to provide the data for your dissertation. If you're doing a survey, such as a quantitative survey through a SurveyMonkey or some other tool, your numbers are going to tend to be higher. But like I said, normally what I see in the outline and even in the prospective stage is that people are saying they're going to interview 100 people, and that's just unrealistic based on what you're trying to do to graduate. Now, if you had a grant and you had all the time in the world to do those type of interviews and studies, yeah, absolutely knock yourself out. But in this particular program, you just want to do what needs to be done and do it correctly so you can be able to graduate and then do whatever you would like to do from an academic, from a practitioner state, or even a combination of both. Again, look at your methodologist book, such as Creswell, as well as other dissertations. You may recall in the last lecture that you should be pulling dissertations of similar scope and study interest so you can see what trends exist, and also you want to do a comparative analysis. And so the example that I provided for the second sentence, and that's actually recommended, you could be the second or the third one, but you want to state that the proposed qualitative study will consist of data from 20 participants from the Midwest region of the United States. And so that's an example that tells you that what this particular study will be. It is the why you're conducting the study, and you're adding the further decomposition from your specific problem. And then you want to cite as recent research as possible due to ever-changing nature of variables, meaning that some of the study interest that you may have has been adversely affected by the pandemic, especially in education, healthcare, and even in the financial sector. You want to make sure that your research is more reflective of those current trends instead of something that may be, unfortunately, outdated, even though the pandemic may have happened officially a couple of years ago. So for an alignment checklist, just something to keep in mind, you want to make sure that your statements and your sentences are specific and concise. Do not ramble. Again, using Grammarly will help you tighten up some of your sentences so it's short and specific and straight to the point. You want to identify the same target population as in your problem statement. So if you're talking about the specific problem is to look at the educators as it affects educational attainment outcomes. You want to say, okay, the specific problem will look at 20, well, the specific problem will explore perceptions of 20 educators in the Midwest. And so you don't, and when you're looking at narrowing your population, you don't want to narrow it to the point where it makes it very difficult, next to impossible, to collect the data. So you have to understand that even though you have a great idea, in theory, that's not guaranteed that you can collect all the data in your desired region. So you want to make the region to have a sizable population, but not to the point where it's too broad. So I live in St. Louis. And so if I wanted to do a study in St. Louis, I would look at the Midwest, because if I can't collect the data in St. Louis, then I could collect the data in Kansas City or Indianapolis, because that is considered part of the Midwest. And a lot of the characteristics are remotely similar across the board, maybe compared to educational outcomes in the southeastern region of the United States. Here are the references, and this is actually a short lecture, and some of them will be shorter. So when we look at the research questions and developing a hypothesis, that will be relatively short as well. But again, these are just lectures just to help you out as you're working on your outline, your perspectives, and be able to provide a little bit more clarity. And you can always look back and just pull this lecture out anytime that you wish. So these are just some of the references I use to help set up the support for this particular lecture. But again, you should be able to drive your own research to determine what's appropriate and what's not appropriate for your research study. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.